Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Megillah, and in today's share we will be learning Mirza Hashem Daf Kuf Nun Ches Amid Beis. We begin on the bottom line of Kuf Nun Ches Amid Aleph with a new Siman Taf Reish Tzadik Beis Dine Berachos HaMegillah. The halachos that pertain to the berachos that we make over the reading of the Megillah, Uboy Dalet Seifim, and here we have 4 Seifim. Says the Mechaber Sef Aleph, HaKorei Es HaMegillah, the one who reads the Megillah, Mevarech Lefaneha Shalosh Berachos, recites 3 berachos before the reading of the Megillah, and those berachos are Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kiddushanu B'Mitzvosav V'Tzivanu Al Mikra Megillah. That's the first bracha. The second bracha is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam V'Sha'asa Nisim Laviseinu Bayom Mehem B'Zman Hazeh. And then finally, the third bracha is V'Shecheyanu, the bracha of Siman, the bracha of Shecheyanu, to thank the Ribbono Shel Olam for allowing us to reach the milestone of Purim together with the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, and we're going to see some of the other mitzvahs hayom as well. Now, the shita of the Mechaber now says, Ubayom, by day, Einoi Chayzer Umevarech Shehecheyanu. So the Mechaber started off here by saying that by Mikra Megillah, by Megillah laning, the Baal Koreh recites 3 brachas, and the last one of those brachas was Shehecheyanu. But the Mechaber was speaking about the Megillah laning of the night. Says the Mechaber here, top of Kuf Nun Ches Amid Beis, Ubayom, but when you go to lein the Megillah by day, Einoi Chayzer Umevarech Shehecheyanu, you do not make a Shehecheyanu by day. That's the shita of the Mechaber, and in the Mishnah Berurah we'll see why the Mechaber holds that way. But the Ramah says right away, Hagab, v'yesh omrim, there are those that say, v'yesh omrim, there are those that say, da'af b'yoim mevarech shecheyanu, that by day you make a shecheyanu as well. V'chein noihagin b'chol medinos elu, and the Ramah says that that indeed is the minig in our regions. Now, the shita of the Mechaber, that you don't make a shecheyanu by day, if you take a look at the Berurah Ois Cotton Bays, he brings this down from the Torah in the name of the Rambam. And as far as the Ramah shita, that we do make a shecheyanu in by day, that's also brought down from the Torah. That's in the name of Rabbeinu Tam, the Rosh, the Magid Mishnah. Okay, now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Cotton Aleph. V'shecheyanu. The third bracha that we make is shecheyanu. V'nachain, the Chavetz Chaim says it is proper lechavein bebirka shecheyanu, to have kavana when we make the bracha of shecheyanu, not only for the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, but gam al mishloach manos useudas purim shehem gam kein mitzvahs. The Chavetz Chaim tells us that when we make that shecheyanu on the Mikra Megillah, we should have in mind that it goes on more than just the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah. It goes on the other mitzvahs hayom as well, which are, he says here, mishloach manos and Su'udas Purim. Now, there's an obvious question, which is, there's a third one of the mitzvahs hayom. What happened to Matanas Le'Evyonim? How come the Chavetz Chaim mentions Mishloach Manos and Su'udas Purim, but he leaves out Matanas Le'Evyonim? So that's a question that we're going to have to answer. But first, let's go a little further in the Mishnah Berurah. And the Mishnah Berurah says, since it's important to have these mitzvahs in mind by the Shecheyanu, the idea you should make this known lahashliach tzibor hamevarech, to the Baal Koreh who's making the bracha. And you know, in a lot of shuls at Batei Midrashim, the Gabbai gives a clap before Mikra Megillah, and he says everyone should have in mind to be yotze with the brachas of the Baal Koreh, and they should have in mind by the Shecheyanu that the Shecheyanu goes on the mitzvah hayom. It goes on not only Mikra Megillah, but on the Suda, on Mishloach Manos, on Matanas Le'Evyonim. But it's not only the tzibur that has to have that in mind, it's also the Baal Koreh who's making the bracha that has to have it in mind. And so says the Chavetz Chaim here, you have to point out to the Baal Koreh who's making the brachas that he has to have in mind that the Shechiyanu goes on those mitzvahs. The be'inon kavana shemeya umashmiya, because it's not enough for the tzibur, who are the shoymim, the ones that are listening to the bracha, for them to have it in mind. The mashmiya, the balkara, who is making the bracha, he has to have in mind to be moitzi the tzibur with a Shechiyanu on those mitzvahs. Now, says the Chavetz Chaim, really, the Mechaber, this Mishnah Berurah is cut in Aleph, was going on the words of the Mechaber. Now, let's remember, the Mechaber said you make a Shechiyanu by night, but you do not make a Shechiyanu by day. Now, we paskin like the Ramah. The Ramah, at least us Ashkenazim, we paskin like the Ramah. The Ramah says make the bracha of Shechiyanu by day as well. When do we have in mind for the Shechiyanu on the Suda b'Shlach Manos HaBatanos Lavyonim? Not by night, because that's not the Zman of those mitzvahs. Those mitzvahs are done by day. And that's why, says the Chavetz Chaim now, v'yechavin zeh beberachos Shechiyanu to yoim. We have to have the Sudas Purim, b'Shlach Manos HaBatanos Lavyonim, we have to have those mitzvahs in mind by the Shechiyanu, by the day's Kriya. Ki zmanam bayoim, because the proper time for the kiyum of those mitzvahs is by day, not by night. Okay, let's pause here in the Mishnah Berurah for a moment, and let's take a look at a Dirshu footnote to answer the question that I posed to you, which is, why does the Chavetz Chaim say we should have in mind by the Shechiyanu the mitzvahs of B'Shloach Manos and Sudas Purim, but he does not mention Matanos Levyonim? So if you take a look here in Dirshu footnote number 1, it says over here, as far as the rationale for why the Chavetz Chaim left out Matanos Levyonim, Kasa b'shalos tshuvas v'anhagos, b'shalos tshuvas v'anhagos, shahoyel v'gam kol hashana chayiv b'mitzvahs tzedakah. Ultimately, Matanos Levyonim is the mitzvah of tzedakah. But we have a specific mitzvah on Purim with a specific shear, right? You have to give mazon shtei sudos to 2 aniyim, so there's a specific shear. There's a mitzvah hayoim on Purim to give tzedakah of a certain type. But the mitzvah of tzedakah is noyeg every day the whole year. V'loini keres ha-mitzvah shesamach ba. And therefore, it's a little difficult to make a Shechiyanu on Purim for a mitzvah that really is an extension of the mitzvah of tzedakah that we have every day all year. So what do we make the Shechiyanu, thanking the Rabbeinu Shalom Mamish, Shechiyanu v'kimanu v'kiyanu lazman hazeh, when we have this mitzvah of tzedakah? You have a mitzvah of tzedakah every day all year. Lachein ein berachos Shechiyanu al kach. And therefore, he says that the Shechiyanu does not go on Matanos Levyonim. Ubeshalos tshuvas petzel hachachma bier sheyesh hasovrim. There are those that hold sheyesh lekayim es mitzvahs Matanos Levyonim kaidam atfila. There are those that say that there's an inyan to be mekayim Matanos Levyonim before davening. And if you're going to do Matanos Levyonim before davening, so then the Shechiyanu that you make by Mikra Megillah or by davening Purim morning cannot possibly go on Matanos Levyonim, because you'll be mekayim the mitzvah earlier than that. Nimsa shekishu mavar Shechiyanu kvar kiyem es mitzvahs Matanos Levyonim. However, Hoysef, he adds, Shalamaisa ha'olam eina medaktikim loseis Matanos Levyonim kaim batfila. That's not the minute to give Matanos Levyonim dafka before davening. So this does not really seem to be a practical answer to the question. Achein ha'prima godim kasav. Finally, he brings down over here. I don't know why this is all the way at the end of the footnote in brackets. If I was writing the footnote, that's certainly not the way I would have written it. Achein ha'prima godim. The Pri Megadim Kasav, the Pri Megadim writes, Sheyechavein beberachos Shechiyanu gam al Matanos Levyonim, that indeed, when you hear, when the Balkar makes the bracha of Shechiyanu in the morning by Mikra Megillah, and when the Tzibur hears it, they should have in mind, gam al Matanos Levyonim, v'chein Kasav HaChayodam, so writes the Chayodam, v'akis Shulchan Aruch. So, a little bit of an odd footnote to me, because the footnote opens with a shalos tshuvas v'anhagos, then it brings down over here a shalos tshuvas tzel chachma, and then finally at the end of the footnote he lets you know that the Pri Megadim and the Chayodam and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch all say that indeed you should have Matanos Levyonim in mind by the Shechiyanu. I know here in Yeshiva Staten Island before Mikra Megillah in the morning, I happen to be the gabbai that gives the klap. I clap on the bima and I say everyone should have in mind to be yotze with the berachos, and by the Shechiyanu, they should have in mind that the Shiachud goes not only on Mikra Megillah, but also on the other mitzvahs hayom, Tahainu, Sudas Purim, Mishloach Manos, and Matanas Le'evyonim. Okay, now, going further in the Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah now poses a very interesting question. He doesn't pose the question, but he tackles a very interesting question. We're making a Shechiyanu on Mikra Megillah. That's when we make the Shechiyanu. We're told that we should have in mind by that Shechiyanu the other mitzvahs hayom as well. But we make the Shechiyanu over the Mikra Megillah. What happens if you're not going to hear the Megillah? What happens if you're stuck somewhere, you don't have a Megillah, you don't have a minyan to go to, you don't have anybody who has a Megillah to lane for you, so unfortunately it's a Purim that you're not going to hear Megillah. Now I used to give share on halachos like this, and they used to be like almost a little bit outlandish, but now, unfortunately we could imagine what happens if there's a pandemic, and you're in, what's that thing called? It starts with a Q, quarantine, and you're not going to hear the Megillah. So Shechiyanu is then, there's no Shechiyanu at all. Now, let's think about this for a minute. We always make a Shechiyanu on a Yom Tov, right? So Purim doesn't get a Shechiyanu. If there's no Mikra Megillah, you don't get a Shechiyanu. So the Chavetz Chaim tackles this, and then we're going to see how he tackles it in the Mishnah Berurah, and then we'll see a fascinating biur halacha. Says the Chavetz Chaim here in Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Aleph, continuing, Umi she'ein lo Megillah. Somebody who does not have a Megillah, lo yivarech Shechiyanu al mishloach manos u'seuda. Okay, you don't have a Megillah, so you're not going to make a Shechiyanu on the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah because you're not going to be yotze the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah. Okay, how about making a Shechiyanu on the other Sudas hayom? Make a Shechiyanu on Sudas Purim. Make a Shechiyanu on Mishloach Manos. Dare I suggest, make a Shechiyanu on Matanas Le'evyonim. So, says the Mishnah Berurah, no, you can't make a Shechiyanu on Mishloach Manos or on Sudas Purim. Why? Tezehu davar hanohug b'chol yom u'b'chol Shabbos v'yom tov. Says you can't make a Shechiyanu on Sudas Purim. You can't make a Shechiyanu on Mishloach Manos. Why? Because they're not significant in that these are types of mitzvahs that only come mizman lizman, the Magen Avram says. Every Shabbos, you have a special Suda. Every Shabbos, you have 3 Seudos of Shabbos. So now today's Purim, and you have a Sudas Purim. So yeah, it's different because it's a Sudas Purim. It's not a Sudas Shabbos. But a Sudas Mitzvah, because it's a special day, that's something that's very common. Now, Mishloach Manos, first of all, there's 2 reasons why, he doesn't say the Chavetz Chaim, but why don't you say Mishloach Manos is Ba Mizman Lizman? Mishloach Manos is a mitzvah that's only once a year. How is Mishloach Manos something that's Nod B'chol Yom or B'chol Shabbos v'Yom Tov? But in a way it is. Why? First of all, we saw earlier in Siman Taf Reish Pei Ches, in Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Yud Ches, we were discussing the halachos of somebody who lives in an open city who travels to a walled city, or somebody who lives in a walled city who travels to an open city. Which day of Purim does he celebrate? And we said, what's the deciding factor? The critical factor is, where will you be the morning of Purim? The morning of Purim, that's the Iker. Where are you going to be the morning of Purim? Then we spoke about, I'm mixing up 2 different halachas. I am sorry. Taf Reish Pei Ches. This is something later in this year. In Taf Reish Pei Ches, we were discussing the question of when you make the Sudas Purim if you have an Ir Mukaf Chayma and Tesvav Shushan Purim falls out on Shabbos. So we said that they have to lane the Megillah on Erev Shabbos. You can't lane the Megillah on Shabbos because of the Gzeret Shebi Avirenu Talan Amos Bereshus Harabim. So they lane the Megillah on Erev Shabbos. Then the question became, when do they make the Suda? So the Mechaber said, Ve'ein oiseh b'Sudas Purim ad Yom Echad b'Shabbos. You make the Sudas Purim on Sunday, not on Shabbos. Why not on Shabbos? So we learned that from a pasuk, because the pasuk says, Las ois oisam yemei mishteh. So the mishteh of Purim has to be on a day that gets a mishteh because of Gzeres Chachamim. Shabbos gets a mishteh because of a daraisa. Shabbos is Shabbos b'daraisa. Purim is when your Dalet and Tesvav fall out, which is decided by the Chachamim when they make Rosh Chodesh. Be that as it may, when is Sudas Purim? For the Ir Mukaf Chayma, if Tesvav falls out on Shabbos, the Sudas Purim is on Sunday. The Mishnah Berurah over there said, because the Sudas Purim is on Sunday, Mishlach Manos is also on Sunday. Why? Because what's the real mitzvah of Mishlach Manos? To send something for the Suda. So the mitzvah of Mishlach Manos is linked to the mitzvah of Sudas Purim. And therefore, if Sudas Purim doesn't get a Shechiyanu, because it's something that's noyig, b'chol yom, b'chol Shabbos, b'chol Yom Tov, so Mishlach Manos, which is attached to the Suda, perhaps also isn't able to get its own independent Shechiyanu if it's not linked to a Shechiyanu on Mikra Megillah. Another possible reason I thought for that is that Mishlach Manos, in a way, is something which is very common. Somebody invites you for a Suda on Shabbos. You bring a bottle of wine, right? You give them a bottle of wine before Shabbos. You go for a Yom Tov, somebody's hosting you. You bring a hostess gift. So Mishlach Manos is also not something that is so rare and it's bam yizman l'zman that you would give it a Shechiyanu if it's not linked to Mikra Megillah. So again, what's the Chavetz Chaim saying over here? We learned, the Mechaber told us, that you make a Shechiyanu on Mikra Megillah. The Chavetz Chaim told us, when you make the Shechiyanu on Mikra Megillah, you should also have in mind the other mitzvahs hayom, like Sudas Purim and Mishlach Manos, and we saw perhaps Matanas Lev Yoinim as well. Now comes along the question, what happens if you don't have Mikra Megillah? You're somewhere where you're not going to have Mikra Megillah. Could you make a Shechiyanu on the other mitzvahs hayom? Says the Magen Avraham, no. You can't make a Shechiyanu on Sudas Purim or on Mishlach Manos because they're not something that it would be appropriate to make a Shechiyanu on. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. V'yesh oimrim. However, there are those that say, Deroi levarek zman al hayoim. Forget making a Shechiyanu on the other mitzvahs, on Sudas Purim, on Mishlach Manos. There are those that suggest, make a Shechiyanu on the Yom, on Purim. You make a Shechiyanu on Sukkot. You make a Shechiyanu on Pesach, right? The Shechiyanu that we make on Sukkot is not only on eating in the Sukkah, it's on Yom Tov. Your wife goes to Tzin she makes a Shechiyanu v'kimanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh, to the Zman of Sukkot. So, if you reached Purim, make a Shechiyanu on Purim. So, v'yesh oimrim, deroi levarech zman al hayoim. We should make a Shechiyanu simply on the Yom Tov of Purim and the great nace that happened on Purim. And since this is a celebration that comes only once a year, it's like any other Yom Tov. Where we always make a Shechiyanu. Va'ayin bebir halacha. Okay. On that note, the Chavetz Chaim tells us, for further discussion of this question, of making a Shechiyanu independent of Mikra Megillah, make a Shechiyanu on the Yom of Purim, he says, see the Bir Halacha, and we're going to see that Bir Halacha in a moment, but let's finish this Ois Katna of the Mishnah Berurah first. Okay, however, this open question notwithstanding, in Mahayaloi Megillah Palayla, certainly, if you did have access to a Megillah at night, Uberech O Shechiyanu, and you made a Shechiyanu on the Mikra Megillah at night, certainly you would not make another Shechiyanu by day if you don't have a Megillah. This whole question of would you make a Shechiyanu on the Yom Tov of Purim if you do not have a Megillah? Well, if you had a Megillah by night, so you made a Shechiyanu by night, then certainly you don't make a Shechiyanu by day independent of Mikra Megillah. Because you're not going to make a Shechiyanu on Sudas Purim and Mishlach Manos, like the Chavetz Chaim said from the Magen Avraham. Those are not mitzvahs that are appropriate for a Shechiyanu. And you're not going to make a Shechiyanu on the day of Purim because you already made a Shechiyanu last night. That would cover whatever Shechiyanu you would make on the day of Purim. Let's finish this ois cotton. Im Avel Karei Megillah. If somebody who Nebuchadnezzar Elenu is an Avel is the Bal Karei, Yevarich Achar HaBrachos. Somebody else should make the brachos. He should not make the brachos. Why? Mishar Birka Shechiyanu. Because one of the brachos is Shechiyanu. She'ena Avel Mevarich Lahitzi Rabbe Bebirka Shechiyanu. It's not appropriate for an Avel to be Moitzi at Tzibur with the brach of Shechiyanu. Somebody who's in Avelis stays away from Shechiyanu. Like we don't make a Shechiyanu, right? During the 3 weeks. We don't make a Shechiyanu because of Avelis. So it's not appropriate for an Avel to be Moitzi the Tzibur in a brach of Shechiyanu. The Ha'avel Yikres HaMegillah. So somebody else will make the brachos, and the Oval will be the Bal Kairei. Now this question, by the way, of somebody other than the Bal Kairei making the brachos is something that we're going to discuss later in the shir, the mechanics of how that works. Before I go to the Bir Halacha, I want to do Ois Kat Beis in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mechaber's position was, Ubayayim Einoi Chayzer Umavarich. The Mechaber took the position that you make a Shechiyanu by Mikra Megillah by night, but you do not make a Shechiyanu by Mikra Megillah by day. Says the Chavetz Chaim, why would that be? Taharei Kfar Berech Balayla. The Mechaber holds that once you made a Shechiyanu on the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah by night, you don't now go ahead and make a Shechiyanu by Mikra Megillah by day. Essentially, it's the same mitzvah. It's Mikra Megillah by night, Mikra Megillah by day. You made a Shechiyanu by night. Why are you making a Shechiyanu again by day? Sounds like a very reasonable position. So what's pshat in the Ramah? That the Ramah says make a Shechiyanu by both. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. The Tam Hadei Shnia, the rationale for the Ramah's position, the Severis the Af B'Yom, who holds that you make a Shechiyanu by day as well, the Iker Mitzvahs Kriyasa by Yomhu, because he says that the Iker Mitzvah of Mikra Megillah is by day. Now, let's take a look at Dirshu footnote number 5. The Mechaber says that you don't repeat Shechiyanu by day. You made a Shechiyanu by night, you don't repeat it again by day. How about the brach of Shasa Nisab Laviseinu? The brach of Shasa Nisab Laviseinu we're making by night and by day. Why is that any different? As a matter of fact, just to put the question in perspective, let's remember when we learned Hilchos Chanukah, we learned that you make a brach of Shasa Nisab Laviseinu every day. And the Mefarshim were very careful to point out the reason you make Sha'asa Nisab Laviseinu every day of Chanukah is because every day was a new nes. Every day they lit the menorah from a pach shemen that should not have had enough oil to light another day. So every day is another nes. Not only is every day another nes, but every day the nes got bigger. So it's very appropriate to make a new brach of Sha'asa Nisab Laviseinu by Yom Mehem Bizman Hazeh every day of Chanukah. But on Purim, we made a Shasa Nisab Laviseinu last night. Why are we making Shasa Nisab Laviseinu again by day? Did the nace get bigger? Why are we making another Shasa Nisab Laviseinu? So, in the footnote here it says, Umashel Adasa Shulchan Aruch Chayzer Umavarech Birchas Shasa Nisab Bayoim Afshek Kfar Birch Balayla Bir B'Shal Sechuvah Sigris Moshe the Rishiva Zatzal Rav Moshe Zechatzad of Kadosh Levracha writes in a tshuva Shel Inyan Birchas Shasa Nisim L'chol Adayas HaBracha Shibirch Balayla You cannot cover the day with the night. You need two Shasa Nisim. Why? Let's remember that a mainstay of the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah is Persume Nisa. And the Iker Persume Nisa of Mikra Megillah is by day, not by night. Varak Lini Berka Shechiyanu Sever Shulchan Aruch Shekevich Birach B'Shas Ascholos Mitzvahs Kriyas Megillah Yoytze B'Zeh Yedei Al Kol Ma'isa Mitzvah Shel Kriyas Megillah Sheyeh Behemshech. For the Shechiyanu, the Mechaber holds you made a Shechiyanu on the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah. The Mikra Megillah by day is a continuation of the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah that you started last night. But the Persume Nisa factor of Mikra Megillah, there's a much greater Persume Nisa by day than there is by night. And that's going to play into the next Dirshu footnote. Let's do the next Dirshu footnote, footnote number 6. But we're not going to start from the beginning. We're going to go a little bit more than halfway down into this footnote. The word at the end of the line, ubetam adover. We just said here in the Mishnah Berurah that the Ramah says that you do make a shechiyanu by day, even though you made one by night. Why? Said the Chavetz Chaim, the Iker mitzvahs kriyasa bayomu. Because the Iker Mikra Megillah is the one by day, not the one by night. And that's where I got confused at the beginning of this year. When we spoke earlier about the halacha of somebody who lives in an open city who travels to a mukafir chayma, or somebody who lives in a walled city that goes to an open city on Purim, the critical factor in deciding when he should commemorate Purim is where he will be in the morning. Why? Because it's the morning Mikra Megillah that's the Iker Mikra Megillah. Why? Why is the daytime Mikra Megillah the Iker? So that's covered over here in this footnote. Ubetama davar she'ikar akriyahu b'yayim. Why is the daytime Mikra Megillah the Iker? Kasva Taisvis, this is a Taisis of Megillah, Davdal and Amad Aleph, there Rush, and the Rush says it over there as well. She'ikar persamanesu b'kriyas hayoim. The Ikar persume nisa is the Mikra Megillah of day. Why? Mishum she'oz hu zman mishteh v'simcha matanis lavyonim. It's in the day that everybody is running around like a chicken without a head, and they're busy with Mishloach Manos. Everybody comes to shul with boxes of Mishloach Manos, and they're giving out to this one and to that one, and everybody's exchanging Mishloach Manos, and they're coming and they're talking about the plans for the Suda, and they're running over to the Rav and to the Gabbai to give Atanas Levyonim. So the Iker excitement is by day. And that's the great Persume Nisa. So the Iker Mikra Megillah is the Mikra Megillah of the day. Okay, we could stop over there. That's the Iker that I wanted to bring out from this footnote. Okay. Let's finish this ice cotton base in the Mishnah Berurah. Then we'll take a look at the Biur Halacha. Continues the Chavetz Chaim 2 lines into Mishnah Berurah's cotton base. Im nishtate kakoire be'emtza ha-Megillah. Let's say, and I could speak unfortunately lately from personal experience, let's say the Balkari is learning the Megillah and his voice goes in middle of Mikra Megillah, or his voice goes in the middle of his Dirshu shir. Im nishtake kakoire be'emtza Megillah. If the Balkari wears out in the middle of the Mikra Megillah, and now somebody else has to replace him. Das ha'achroinim, it's the opinion of the achroinim. The replacement Balkari is not required. Lahaskil barosh. He doesn't have to go back to the beginning of the Megillah. Rak yaskil mimakim shapasik arishain. He could just continue from where the original Balkari left off. The choshkein sheitzarch levarich bechadash. Certainly, he does not have to make new brachos. The yatsu kalakal berachos arishin, because the whole tzibur was yaitz the brachos with the brachos of the original Balkari. And says the Mishnah Berurah, why is this so? That the replacement, the stand-in Balkari, could continue from where the original Balkari left off, to hutercha de tzibura. Because to have the replacement Balkari go back to the beginning of the Megillah, that would be a great tercha de tzibura. The ayin b'shari tshuva, he sends us to the shari tshuva. I'm not going to read the shari tshuva inside, but the shari tshuva does say that if the tzibur is maskim to have the stand-in Balkari start from the beginning, it certainly would be kind of a hiddur mitzvah for the new Balkari to start from the beginning, because to have a kriya where half the Megillah was laid by one fellow and half the Megillah was laid by another fellow, it's a shvacha kriya. You know, people are going to go home and people are going to ask, how was the laning? I don't know. One guy laying, in Talakar Advarim Ha'ele, and then somebody else picked up. It's not geshmak. So the Shari Tshuva says, if the tzibur is maskim, so start from the beginning. Or suggests the Shari Tshuva, if the Kriyas Megillah is Motzei Shabbos. What does that have to do with anything? Very simple. If the Mikra Megillah is on a Tuesday night, that means it's after Tainus Tzibur. Everybody's fasting. It's Motzei Tainus Esther. So yeah, Tercha de Tzibur is a big deal. Everybody wants to go home and break their fast. If it's Motzei Shabbos, nobody fasted today. So the Tercha de Tzibur is not as big an Inyan. By the way, I love to point out to people, if you want to know how big an Inyan Tercha de Tzibur is, you realize every day by Shacharis, after Shemona Esrei, after Chazaras HaShatz, after Tachnun, we say Ashrei V'Olotzion. How come Shabbos morning we don't say Ashrei V'Olotzion? When do we say Ashrei V'Olotzion? By Mincha Shabbos afternoon. Why do we say it by Mincha Shabbos afternoon? The reason we say it by Mincha Shabbos afternoon is because we couldn't say it Shabbos morning. Why couldn't we say it Shabbos morning? It's already a very long davening, Shabbos davening. We don't want to make it unnecessarily longer. So we don't put in Ashrei V'Olsin. Even though Ashrei V'Olsin is part of the Matbeah HaTfilah all week long, we don't put it in on Shabbos because we don't want to make the davening unnecessarily long. So we put it in by Mincha instead. So next time you hear somebody kind of knock Tircha Tzibura or knock the idea that davening is too long, there is a place that davening is not supposed to become a lachatz. Davening is not supposed to become oppressive. So it gets to a point where some people feel, the Mishaberichs are so long by the laning, and that, and a slow bal tefillah, and it is, and that, and it's pashut, a guy comes home after Shabbos davening, Shabbos morning, and he's pashut worn out because he feels a lachatz from the Shabbos davening. That's not a mila. That's called Tircha Tzibura. So there is a place for it. Okay. Now, I would like to dive into this Bir Halacha, Divra Maschil V'Shechiyanu. So, let's just kind of get the paper trail right for this Bir Halacha. The Mishnah Berurah was discussing the question of a Shechiyanu divorced from Mikra Megillah, right? We make the Shechiyanu by Mikra Megillah. But what happens if you don't have a Mikra Megillah? So, we spoke about the question of making a Shechiyanu on the other mitzvahs hayom. You can't make a Shechiyanu on Mikra Megillah because you don't have Mikra Megillah. So make a Shechiyanu on Sudas Purim. Make a Shechiyanu on Mishlach Manas. We brought down the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram said you can't make a Shechiyanu on those mitzvahs. Why not? Because it's not appropriate. Those are not mitzvahs that should get a Shechiyanu. Because those are kind of mitzvahs that are common. The idea of a Suda is not a rare event. We do it 3 times every Shabbos. Mishlach Manas, we said, is not such a rare event, giving gifts to other people, that we should now go ahead and make a Shechiyanu on that mitzvah. Then, the Chavetz Chaim brought down in Mishnah Berurah's Katan Aleph, V'yesh Omrim, there are those that say that, you can make a Shechiyanu divorced from Mikra Megillah. Why? Make a Shechiyanu on the Yom. The same way we make a Shechiyanu on every Yom Tov. So make a Shechiyanu on the Yom of Purim, and on the great nace that occurred on Purim. Why do we need anything more than that? Any greater excuse than that to make a Shechiyanu? And the Mishnah Berurah was not machriya. At the end of the discussion, the Mishnah Berurah said, "V'ayin be'ber halacha." Take a look at the ber halacha. So let's look at the ber halacha. V'shechiyanu. Ayin Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Aleph. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Aleph. Masha kasavnu, what we wrote. The yesh omrim, that there are those that say the royal levarech, that you can make a Shechiyanu divorced from Mikra Megillah. Just make a Shechiyanu on the Yom of Purim. Says the Chavetz Chaim, who mimar ukitzia. This is a shita of the Sefer Mar Ukitzia. Shehisig ala Magen Avram, who takes issue with the Magen Avram. V'zel shaynai, and this is what the Mar Ukitzia writes. V'lo yadati mabakach shu davar nohug. What did the Magen Avram say? The Magen Avram said, sorry, you can't make a Shechiyanu on Sudas Purim, on Mishlach Manas. Those are things that are too common. Says the Mar Ukitzia, mabakach shu davar nohug. So what? So it's common. So don't make a Shechiyanu on Sudas Purim and Mishlach Manas. Make a Shechiyanu on the Yom. Now, you'll tell me you can't make a Shechiyanu on the Yom because it's Divrei Kabbalah. It's something, what's Divrei Kabbalah? Something that's mentioned in Tanakh. Let's remember, Megillas Esther is Ksuvim. It's not even a D'Rabbanan. It's bigger than a D'Rabbanan. V'av shehu Divrei Kabbalah, adarabah, tzarech chizik kishal Torah. Such a great nace happened on Purim, the salvation of Gans Klal Yisrael. So make a Shechiyanu on the Yom, asks the Mar Ukitzia. The Kevin the Mizman Luzman Kaasi, since this is a celebration that comes only once a year, it's like all the Yom Tovim, and we always make a bracha of Zman. And don't worry about a kais. Uzman loy boy kais. You don't need a kais. You'll worry, well, I can't make a Shechiyanu on Purim like I do on the other Yom Tovim because there's no Kiddush. I once saw a fascinating fellow put together a Kiddush for Purim. It's a masterpiece. Of course, there is no Kiddush on Purim. But somebody I know put together a Kiddush for Purim. Boy, was it a masterpiece. It was manloi by kais. But the bottom line is, you don't need Kiddush to make a Shechiyanu. You don't need a kais. The Hilchos Megillah Filu B'Shuk. The halacha, and we saw this in Hilchos Yom Tov, you didn't make a Shechiyanu. You can make a Shechiyanu while you're walking in the street during the day on Yom Tov. V'yom HaKippurim she'ein ba'achilu shtia. Yom Kippur, you don't have any Suda. El Shvisa u'menucha. Afal pikein mavarkan I we make a Shechiyanu in Shul. After Kol Nidre, we make a Shechiyanu. U'misayim sham, and the Mar Uketzia concludes, Teshaper hu lechatchila. It is proper lechatchila, laman de lesle Megillah, if somebody doesn't have a Megillah, lemisbach zman akois teseuda. Make a Shechiyanu. You want to do it on a kais? So you have enough wine by the table by Sudas Purim. When you come to the Suda, you have a kais. Pick up a kais, make a Shechiyanu. Ad kan l'shainai, so says the Maruktzia. So the Maruktzia says, yeah, you can make a Shechiyanu, divorced from the mitzvah, Mikra Megillah. What do you make a Shechiyanu on? On the Zman, on the day of Purim. Ube'emes, continues the Chavetz Chaim, lefis farasa, according to the Maruktzia, sheyavarach zman al etzem hayoim, they talk by shalnei shahayabai, that you're making a Shechiyanu on the Yom of Purim due to the great miracle. In Cain, hayaloi levarach gamkein berachos shasanisim. The truth is, you should also make a bracha of shasanisim. You don't have a Megillah, make two brachas. Make a Shechiyanu and shasanisim on the great nays. Ube'emes, says the Chavetz Chaim, Motzasi b'Meiri al Shabbos leading Chanukah. I found in the Meiri when he was talking about Chanukah, v'huadin bin yonedu leading Purim, and it would apply to Purim as well. V'zelu shaynai. This is what the Meiri writes: Misha ein lo lahadlik. If you're not going to light Neres Chanukah, so Chanukah divorced from Neres Chanukah, the same way we're discussing here. Purim divorced from Mikra Megillah. Ve'enam hamakim she'esh lo lirois. So he's not going to light Neres Chanukah. He's not going to see Neres Chanukah. Yesh ayimim shemavarach la'atzmai. There are those that say that he should make an independent bracha. She'asa nisim v'shechiyanu b'layla rishon v'she'asa nisim b'chalaleilos. Every night he should make a bracha of she'asa nisim, divorced from the mitzvah of hadlakas Neres Chanukah, and he should make a shechiyanu at one point during Chanukah, divorced of hadlakas Neres Chanukah. V'hadvarim nirim ad kad l'shayne. And the Meiri says that would seem to be proper. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, and then he says, and I'm going to paraphrase, I'm going to skip some lines here. He says, the Maruktzia asks a kasha on the Magen Avram. He says, Magen Avram, you said that you can't make a Shechiyanu because it's inappropriate to make a Shechiyanu on Sudas Purim and Mishlach Manas. And the Berurah asked on the Magen Avram, forget that, so far, so you can't make a Shechiyanu on those mitzvahs. Make a Shechiyanu on the Yom. You know what, says the Chavetz Chaim? Could be that the Magen Avram actually agrees to the Maruktzia. Why are you assuming that the Magen Avram disagrees with the position of the Maruktzia? And that's why the Magen Avram says that you can't make a Shechiyanu on Sudas Purim and Mishlach Manas because they're too common, says the Chavetz Chaim. Maybe the Magen Avram actually agrees with the Maruktzia. So why does the Magen Avram say you can't make a Shechiyanu? Maybe the Magen Avram is talking about a case where you had a Megillah at night and you made a Shechiyanu at night. And since you made a Shechiyanu at night, you already covered Shechiyanu on the Yom. Now the Magen Avram is just addressing the question of making a Shechiyanu by day, divorced of Mikra Megillah. Over there, he says you can't make a Shechiyanu. Why? Because you can't make a Shechiyanu on the Yom, because you did already last night. You can't make a Shechiyanu on Mishlach Manas and Sudas Purim, because those are mitzvahs that are too common. But maybe the Magen Avram actually agrees to the Maruktzia and to the Meiri that really you should make a Shechiyanu on the Yom. And if you don't have a Megillah, you make a Shechiyanu on the Yom. Now let's skip down over here. We're going to skip down until 6 lines off the end of this Biur Halacha. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Achakach Matzasi beBirkei Yosef. I found in the Birkei Yosef, V'zel Shayne, and this is what he writes, Im ein lo Megillah, Yavar Shechiyanu. You don't have a Megillah, you make a Shechiyanu. Ach lo Yavarach berachos shasanisim. But you don't make a shasanisim. Or berachos aravas rivenu. And you also don't make the bracha of aravas rivenu that we make by night at the end of the Megillah. Aval achrayim kasvu degam shechiyanu leyavarich. But the Birkei Yosef says the achrayim right that you shouldn't even make a shechiyanu. Ad kan l'shaynai. So says the Birkei Yosef. Says the Chavetz Chaim. I don't know what Achronim the Birkei Yosef is talking about. Levad mi Magen Avram ve'Eli Rabba she'etikai. Other than the Magen Avram and the Eli Rabbah, I don't know any Achronim who say don't make a Shechianu if you don't have Mikra Megillah. And let's remember, the Chavetz Chaim just said that he could be that the Magen Avram agrees with the Maruk Tzia that you do make a Shechianu. Umehem ein raya, k'moshe kasavnu. So finally, the Chavetz Chaim says v'tzarich iyun lamaisa. He says lamaisa is leaving this as a big tzarich iyun. And he says, "Va'ayin le'el b'simen tafreish ayin vav b'shar tzion ois gimel." And over there, he left the same tzarich iyun. Here in tafreish ayin vav in Hilchos Chanukah, he has the same problem. He talks about somebody who neglected to make a Shechianu on Chanukah, and he doesn't remember until it's the 8th day of Chanukah during the day. So he's not lighting Chanukah licht anymore. He already lit Chanukah licht last night, the 8th licht. So he's not lighting Chanukah licht anymore. Does he make a Shechianu? And he clears over here the Shaila. He says, I don't know. Do you make a Shechianu because you make a Shechianu on the Yom, like any other Yom Tov, so it's still Chanukah, make a Shechianu? Or does it have to be connected to the mitzvah of Hadlakas Chanukah? And he says, V'tzarachian. So he leaves this as a fascinating tzarachian, but I thought that this was a very fascinating biur halacha and definitely well worth the time to go through this sugya of the question of the shehechiyanu. Okay, now we're already going a little late, but let's push a little bit further over here in the Mechaber. We're actually in the words of the Ramah, second line down, a little bit more than halfway through the line, by the Eis Cut and Gimel for the Mishnah Berurah, says the Ramah. Ve'echad yachal levarech v'sheni karei. There's no problem. One person could make the berachos on Mikra Megillah, and somebody else could lane, which the Mishnah Berurah just mentioned previously. In the case of an oval, if the Malkar is an oval, that's what he says you do. Somebody else should make the berachos, and the oval should lane, because it's inappropriate for the oval to be moitzi the tzibur in the shechiyanu. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cut and Gimel, ve'echad yachal levarech. One person can make the bracha, and somebody else could lane. Now, the truth is that there is a big chiddush in that. Since we're going a little bit late, I'm not going to read the Dirshu footnote inside. I'm going to paraphrase what it says. But if you take a look at Dirshu footnote number 8, he points out that that is not the halacha by Kriyas HaTorah. We know that by Kriyas HaTorah, when you get an aliyah, you make the bracha, and you have to read from the Sefer Torah together with the Balkari. Why? Because if you don't read from the Sefer Torah, your brachos would be a bracha of HaTorah. Why? What are we doing over here by Mikra Megillah? We're saying Ruvain could make the brachos, and Shimon could lane. Why isn't that the same thing? So the answer is, he explains over here, and he takes this from a biur halacha over there in Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah. He says, by Kriyas Megillah, everybody has a chiyuv to lane the Megillah, and everybody has a chiyuv to make the brachos on the Megillah. You are yoitze your chiyuv, both your chiyuv of the brachos and your chiyuv of the laning, through Shemei Ka'ina. So you listen to somebody make the brachos, you say Amen. You listen to the Megillah with Kavanah. You're yoitze the brachos and you're yoitze the Kriyas Megillah, mitam Shemei Ka'ina. That's not the way it works by Kriyas HaTorah. By Kriyas HaTorah, when you hear laning on Shabbos morning, you don't have a chiyuv to make the brachos. You already made berachos HaTorah when you said berachos HaShachar. You have no chiyuv now of berachos HaTorah. The oile has a chiyuv of berachos HaTorah for his aliyah. Now, in order for his bracha not to be a bracha of HaTorah, he has to read from the Sefer Torah. That's why the same person has to make the bracha, the same person has to read. But by Mikra Megillah, it's not that way. Ruvain can make the bracha, be moitzi everybody, and Shimon could lay in the Megillah. Not a problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Cut and Gimel, ve'echad yachal levarech. Says the Chavetz Chaim, this applies bein bracha rishayna, both to the first brachos of Mikra Megillah, the 3 brachos at the beginning, ubein le'inyan bracha achrayna, as well as to the brachos at the end of the Megillah that we have at night. But of course, the one making the brachos has to have kavanah to be moitzi the tzibur, and the listeners have to have kavanah to be moitzi. Sharatzion Ois Cotton Vav brings down over here. He says this is brought from the Arz Beruah and the Darkei Moshe. And v'chein mashma me'agad afilu bracha shelafaneh mutter. But he brings down from the Ritva. Achein b'chidushay Ritva perach hakarei omed the dafka bebracha shela achareha. The Ritva indeed does not like the idea of somebody else making the brachas before the Megillah and then a different person laning. Everybody asks on the Ritva, why would the Ritva hold like that? Like we just said, there doesn't seem to be any reason why it should be that way. They explain that the Ritva is only saying lechatchila. Lechatchila, the same person that makes the brachas should be the one that actually reads the Megillah. I just want to finish off this sif. Let's finish off the Ramah. No. How much is left? You know what? No, we're going to stop over here. So we didn't quite finish the page, but Mirz Hashem will push through tomorrow. Hopefully we'll be able to cover up for the lost ground tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rabban Shem should sing Yeshua Sefurus Parnaset Sheduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Bias Goel Tzedek, the Beher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.